Hello, and welcome. It's nice to be in this more intimate setting for our Strum lectures this year. My name is Noam Pianko. I'm the interim director of the Strum Center for Jewish Studies and a professor in the Jackson School of International Studies. And I'm very thrilled to welcome you to this Strum lecture. This Strum lecture is taking place in the 50th year of the Strum Center's history. And the Strum lecture itself, as the name, yay, congratulations, Strum Center. And the Strum Center itself actually emerged from the Strum lecture. So these two are intimately connected. Sam and Althea Strum had at first had a vision about a lecture that would be an opportunity for the community to learn from scholars of Jewish studies. And that lectureship blossomed into a very important series. We've had incredible speakers over the last several decades, including many important books that came out of these incredible lectures. For example, we have had Irving Howe has been a speaker, Dara Horn, Ruth Behar, Robert Alter. Some of the most well-known books coming out of the series are Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi's classic Zachor. Paula Hyman, who is my teacher, wrote her Gender and Assimilation in Modern Jewish History out of these lectures. In fact, you can still see a video of her delivering the lectures online. And Nita Norwich wrote Writing in Tongues, Translating Yiddish in the 20th Century. So we're really thrilled to be continuing in this long tradition and to be welcoming Dr. Brooten to these ranks. And speaking on the series, speaking to us across three different talks, Jewish Women in Antiquity, Untold Stories of Leadership and Desire. I hope everybody here will join us on Thursday for a talk that will be on Zoom. That'll be 4 p.m., and I believe that's available on our website, so you can get information on how to Zoom in to that. And this event is made possible by the generous support of our donors in the Strum Center. So I see a number of you out there today. Thank you all for your support, for making this all possible and your generosity. I also want to thank our amazing staff. The Strum Center is blessed with a wonderful staff. And these professionals include Leah Vinokur, Kara Schoonmaker, Grace Elizabeth D., Jenny McCullum, Rebecca Hyman, and Kohana Noyasaka. The talk will be about an hour or so, and then we'll take questions and answers. And I will introduce my colleague, Professor Mika Huvia, in a moment, who will oversee the question and answer period. And we have this nifty tool called Slido, and you can go to slido. What? Next slide. No. Wow, who knew? Hey, look at that. See, our amazing staff, right? Always ahead of us professors. So yes, follow this nifty little link here, and you can ask a question and see what other people are asking, and it's a great way to make sure your questions are heard, if possible. And so let me close here by just introducing Professor Mika Ahuvia to introduce our Strum lecturer. Professor Ahuvia holds the Marcia and J. Glazer Endowed Chair in Jewish Studies and is an associate professor in the Jackson School of International Studies. She researches the formative history of Jewish and Christian communities in the ancient Mediterranean world, specializing in late antiquity, Jewish history. She works with rabbinic sources, liturgical poetry, magical texts, early mystical literature, and archaeological evidence. It's always fun to learn with Professor Ahuvia, and I recommend her book. On my right, Michael, on my left, Gabriel, Angels in Ancient Jewish Culture, which investigates conceptions of angels in foundational Jewish texts and ritual sources. So please join me in welcoming Professor Ahuvia to introduce our speaker.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Noam. So it's my privilege now to introduce Professor Bernadette Brooten, who is the Kraft Hyatt Professor, thank you, at Brandeis University. Professor Brooten is also the founding director of the Feminist Sexual Ethics Project at Brandeis. She has held fellowships at the MacArthur, Fulbright, Harvard Law School, and the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies. It's hard for me to exaggerate Professor Brooten's influence on the fields of early Judaism, Christianity, Mediterranean studies, and feminist studies and religion. Long before it was common, Professor Brooten was analyzing culture through non-canonical texts. astrological texts, medical texts, archaeological material. She was looking at evidence of daily life to tell the stories of ordinary ancient people, men, women, and people who didn't fit the gender binary. She was doing it before anybody else was. Her book on love between women, early Christian responses to female homoeroticism, was so impactful on so many fields that it was recently the subject of a special issue of the Journal of Feminist Studies and Religion. It had contributors from archaeologists of the Roman world, gender and sexuality specialists in the Bible, and LGBTQI interpreters of the Bible, and more. In the words of the editor, this book was and is a phenomenon, likely because love between women contains multitudes. As several of the contributors to the special section highlight, it's an incredible resource. Its many different parts inspire and inform so much work in its wake. So that book, Love Between Women, will be the topic of Thursday's talk. But phenomenon is often a word used alongside Professor Brooten's name. Her earliest publication, Women Leaders in the Ancient Synagogue, Inscriptional Evidence and Background Issues, which you'll hear more about tonight, overwhelmingly proved that women were much more than passive participants in the ancient synagogue. They were leaders with titles, not just honorific ones, but functional ones. And if you haven't heard about this research, you've encountered what's called the Brooten phenomenon. So coined by scholars of my generation, the Brooten phenomenon refers to the way that work on or by women fails to cross the bridge into scholarship written by men or purportedly about general topics. So in other words, scholarship about or by women is segregated or marginalized in the field of religion and Jewish studies. It's published, it's powerful, it's compelling. It should shift our perception of the past and the present, and yet the gatekeepers, prefer to neglect it. They don't cite it. They don't teach it. Just last week, I was at the University of Texas at Austin speaking about the portrayal of women in the Dura Europos synagogue. And a student approached me afterwards and said, "Wait, are you saying that there were women in the ancient synagogue?" And I was like, oh, yes. And the fact that you don't know is evidence of the Brooten phenomenon. So please, as I said, you really have to look up Professor Brooten's work or tune into this lecture series in a week. So why is this still the case? All right, maybe in the US in the year 2025, I don't have to explain it. Maybe it's really obvious to you how easy it is to erase the work of previous generations, to tell a very limited story and exclude other stories. And yet for posterity, I'm going to spell it out. I think that taking account of the history of marginalized individuals, including women, would require some men to change their story of the past and the present and their role in it. It would force gatekeepers in the field of Judaism or religion to acknowledge that something is missing in the present, that certain voices are missing in the room, and that our stories and our histories need to be expanded to be more accurate and more ethical. Throughout her career, Professor Brooten didn't just publish powerful research that inspired people across multiple fields. She's always lived out her scholarship. She cites and supports junior scholars. I first met Professor Brooten at an anti-racist pedagogy workshop at the Society of Biblical Literature. I'll never forget that she walked up and introduced herself, and I was just shocked. I was like, I can't believe Professor Brooten is talking to me. So she was teaching us. She was really teaching us how to read. She encouraged us to ask about how Jews and Christians, freed, and enslaved, interpreted biblical texts on slavery and freedom. She challenged us to read for freedom. Her work has influenced my own research to reimagine the foundations of classical Judaism. Right? So my recent article includes stories by and about foster children, enslaved women, and highlights their contribution to Jewish ways of seeing the world and the invisible realm. Right? How did foster children, enslaved people, imagine God and angels, and how does that continue to survive in our sources? How can we see those voices? In recognition of her impact, the Society of Biblical Literature formed the Bernadette J. Brooten Award, which supports and encourages early career researchers, developing innovative approaches to the critical study of gender, sexuality, and/or embodiment in relation to biblical texts and traditions broadly cast, especially with projects that foreground feminist, womanist, queer, and/or trans approaches. So if any of you are interested in that kind of research, apply for that award. So especially these days, right, as forces are undermining research on women and marginalized diverse individuals, I am so gratified to welcome Professor Bernadette Brooten as our distinguished Strom lecturer. Thank you all for being here tonight, and please join me in giving her a warm welcome.
Oh my goodness, I have had wonderful introductions before, but never anything like that. Thank you so much, and I am so pleased to be here. I want to thank all the people who have brought me here, the staff with whom I've communicated, who were patient when I didn't get back to them right away, and Mika Ahuvia, Professor Ahuvia, who has invited me, and to see Sarah Levine Richardson and Deborah Kamen here is a great honor to me. And I thank the donors. I really want to thank the donors for making it possible to explore the complexities of Jewish history and culture. And because I work on the ancient synagogue and am very aware of the significance of donations, I bring a special sensitivity to that. So thank you. Let's see. Oop. Okay, the screen is, oh, it's going. But I'm not seeing it on the screen. I need to see what I've got here so I can. Can we get back? Yeah, okay. There, yeah, we gotta go way back, okay. There, okay, yes, lovely, thank you. So, there, that's a good way. So today, transgender and intersex are being discussed far more broadly in the Jewish community and in society as a whole. And one of the earliest of the relatively contemporary works was this book, Balancing on the Mechitza. So the Mechitza, I'm going to explain, some people will have incredible knowledge, other people won't. I'm going to go back and forth. And so the Mechitza is a divider between women and men in Orthodox synagogues and some other synagogues, and they take different forms. They might be a divider right down the middle. This here, you see it's beautifully etched with glass and wood. They might be a gallery, a separate women's gallery. They might be behind a lattice work. I've been in various synagogues that have these. So where would a transgender person sit? So I thought, I wonder what that means about antiquity. And here are a couple of the most recent and really profound books on this phenomenon. Max Strassfeld, a prize-winning book, Trans Talmud, Androgynes and Eunuchs in Rabbinic Literature. I'll be talking about the meaning of those terms. And Sarah Lev's book has just come out, and the sages did not know. It's about intersex. So where would a non-binary person that is a tumtum and androgynous, the rabbis, the early rabbis, the sages, the ancient rabbis, by which I mean rabbis of the beginning in kind of the end of the 1st century BCE, but really the 1st century BCE on through the finish of the codification of the Babylonian Talmud in the 6th century. So I'm talking about the earlier end of that. So that's what I mean by these terms. So, and they use the term tumtum and androgynous. So we'll be talking about this, and where would they sit in the ancient synagogue? So first of all, what is a tumtum? What is an androgynous? And then Philo of Alexandria, a 1st century BCE, 1st century CE Jewish philosopher from Alexandria in Egypt, a major center of learning with a very large library, also uses the term gun andros, who uses androgynos and gynandros, and I'll explain those also. Well, I think we all know that today the terminology is confusing and ever-changing. And the people in the room who are grandparents are confronted with the students and young people, their grandchildren, saying, well, don't you even know that? And the grandparents are trying to keep up. You've added one more letter now to the mix. What does this letter mean? How can I keep up with all these letters? Well, the terminology is changing. And many say, well, we don't want categories at all anyway. But antiquity was also complex like that. There were also various categories. People didn't use them in the same way, and their meanings changed over time. So let's look at the term androgynos. So it's a Greek word coming from two elements, man and woman, andro and gynos, as in gynecology and so forth. And the sages, the early rabbis, took the name, the word, and used it as a loan word in early rabbinic literature. And they spelled it androgynos, which is the way it would have been pronounced in their time anyway. So, but what does it mean for them? So the Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, whom I just mentioned, he describes an androgynos as a boy with whom an adult man has sex, whose male nature has been transformed into a female nature, hence androgynos. And he writes, the androgynos should not be suffered to live for a day or even an hour. So people today have many views about homosexuality and so forth, but few of us today, if we learn of a man having sex with a boy, first blame the boy. We differ from the ancients. We don't first blame the boy. Whereas for Philo, that was the one who had been transformed, who had been effeminated. And so you first blame the boy. And then he says, assuming that his audience doesn't blame the man, and also the man who does this should know that he too is culpable because he has taught effeminacy and unmanliness to the boy. So this goes back to the book of Leviticus, that a male who lies with a male as with another woman, as with a woman, it is an abhorrence, an abomination, a to'eva in Hebrew. And that's what he's basing himself on. So that's one meaning of androgynos. The earliest rabbis, as I mentioned, speak of tumtum va'androgynos, that is a tumtum and an androgynos. So the question is a tumtum a person with genitals covered over with skin so that you have doubt? And that is the usual interpretation. Gwen Kessler isn't sure that we actually can be sure. But you do have other ancient sources writing about, for example, a woman, Diodorus of Sicily wrote about a woman who married a man, lived with him as a wife, then had a tumor and became ill, and a penis burst forth. And the physicians were able to fix it, and he then lived as a man. So in other words, the idea of doubt and skin breaking and some other genitals appearing was something that ancient people thought of. So we might not know precisely. The androgynous, again, we generally think of an androgynous as a person with both male and female genitalia, so 100%, not a little in this direction or a little in that direction. But again, with Gwen Kessler, we may not know. They mostly don't say. They just say an androgynous. So there are a number of texts on the androgynous and the tumtum, and one that has received a great deal of attention is from an early rabbinic work called the Tosefta. So the Mishnah is the basis of the Babylonian Talmud, what we call the Talmud, and the Jerusalem Talmud. They are the sayings of the earliest rabbis found in the Mishnah, and then the two Talmuds build upon and comment upon those sayings and then go off on tangents. We call it the ocean of the Talmud. You just you start thinking of this, and oh yeah, that reminds me of this other thing. And then you go off in that direction, and so you're on to a wonderful other conversation. So this one, the Tosefta, is parallel to the Mishnah, so rabbis of the same time period, but not the basis of the Babylonian and Jerusalem Talmuds. So in this we read, the androgynous is in some ways like men, in some ways like women, in some ways like both men and women, and in some ways like neither men nor women. And they go into detail then on some of those ways. And they call an androgynous a he. And he may not seclude himself, in Hebrew mityahed, with women like men. And they then go on to say, and he may not be secluded mityahed with men like women. Okay, so this is the rabbinic concept of yichud. Yichud means separation, aloneness, separation. Not separation, the opposite, being secluded with, being alone with. So the rabbis thought sex can happen anywhere at any time, and we better really watch out to prevent it. Okay? They thought people are just going to have it. And they had the category of building a fence around the Torah. So there's some people with whom one is prohibited to have sex, and you don't want that to happen, so you do things to prevent it from happening. And one of the things was, if you don't want a man to have sex with women, don't let him be with women who are prohibited to him, and the same with women. So if we look at this, how would that fit into the synagogue? He's not allowed to be alone with men in the men's section. He's not allowed to be with women in the women's section. Where is he going to sit? It also has another sadder implication, which is, now this is idealistic, aspirational thinking. Law is never a reflection of reality. But the way the rabbis are thinking about it, how would a person make a living? If you're a man and you can't go out working with other men, and you can't go working with women, where are you going to work? Where are you going? Well, you could be in the marketplace because you have everybody there. You could be on the open road. You have everybody there. But it would severely limit where you could be, with whom you could be close. So we were discussing this. Where would they sit if we follow this idea of ichud? This raises a fascinating question that goes far beyond the issue of the tumtum and the androgynous. Did the early rabbis control the synagogue? And did ancient synagogues even separate people by gender at all? Now, Ruth Langer, a very important historian of Jewish liturgy, in an article, describes how the earliest ancient rabbis obliged all people to pray daily, but not in a particular place. And these rabbis preferred to pray in places other than the synagogue. And I found a saying of a rabbi, Rabbi Dosa ben Harkinas, from the 1st, 2nd century CE, so in technical terms, a first generation Tana. In Tractate Avot, that is one of the tractates of the Mishnah, also known as Pirkei Avot, 310, that sitting in the synagogues of the ignorant take a man from the world, as well as some other things like sleeping in late. He doesn't like that, sleeping in late. It's not good. Not good. Okay, but sitting in the synagogues of the ignorant. Ah, the synagogues of the ignorant. So, you are in for a surprise. Ta-da! What do we have here? This is the floor of a synagogue. It is not the only floor of a synagogue, with a beautiful mosaic that has right in the center a human face with rays coming out of it, and presented with a chariot that from other iconography we know to be the sun god Helios. How did the sun god Helios get into a synagogue right in the middle of the floor? And here we have the larger picture of this. This is, as you can see, Hamat Tiberia, Hamat Tiberias, an important synagogue in Galilee. So surrounding this sun god Helios, we see the signs of the zodiac. What are they doing in there? Okay, do the rabbis want us to follow astrology? At the top, you have what we would expect to find: 2 7-branched menorahs, those little things to the left of each menorah. Looks a little bit like a sword. It's actually a lulav. That's typical. So, a ritual branch, palm branch. Then you have, over at the sides, you have an incense shovel. Then you have what might be a shofar. Those are typical things. Then around it, you have a braid. So in other words, no iconography there that would disturb anyone from, do not make graven images before me and have human beings and so forth. At the bottom, you have some donative inscriptions that made it all possible. Okay, so scholars being confronted with these have asked the question, did the early rabbis want an image of the sun deity and signs of the zodiac? So some have worked very hard to say, well, really, there wasn't a conflict, and okay. But I don't think it's what we would have expected. It is a surprise. But there's another way to look at this, which is other Jews-controlled synagogues, not the sages. The sages controlled the houses of study. So the Beit Midrash, where you study the Torah and you pass down the sayings of your teacher and you debate about the meaning of the Torah and of the oral Torah, the sayings, the teachings that the rabbis believed to be also passed down from Mount Sinai, namely something that was ba'al-peh, something that was on the mouth rather than written. And that's what they were interested in, and that's what they controlled at the beginning. Now later, of course, the rabbis did gain control of the synagogues. And so today, all of the branches of Judaism, which differ greatly in many ways, use the rabbinic liturgy. So the Amidah and so forth are used from Reconstructionist and cover wrote and Reform Judaism and Conservative Judaism and Orthodox Judaism, Modern Orthodox Judaism and Haredim all use the rabbinic liturgy. But it wasn't that way in the earliest period. And Ruth Langer, with her very detailed and intensive study of the Jewish liturgy, confirms that. Okay, so then the next question is, was there a women's section or a women's divider? In the Middle Ages, yes. And in the Middle Ages, you also have Byzantine churches and Western churches dividing women from men. And in Islam, You also have women divided from men in a mosque, in prayer, in public prayer. The medieval Islamic jurists, the faqih, came up with a solution to a person of a non-binary person. And they first said, well, if they tend more toward maleness, they should go to the men's side. If they tend more toward females, they go to the women's side. But if you really can't get them in one direction, if they really are like totally non-binary, we have a men's section, a women's section, and a section for the non-binary people in the middle. Yeah. So it's fascinating. They also dealt with this issue, and that was the way they solved it. Okay, let's look at ancient synagogues now, archaeologically, and I can give you just a few examples. So this synagogue of Gamla is a 1st century synagogue. It functioned until 67 CE, i.e. was destroyed by the Romans. It's on the Golan Heights. I have visited it. And you can see that it has benches. You see here I'm not going to move away from this, but you can see the benches around. That is typical for those 1st century synagogues. Here we have to the west in Italy, Ostia, a proposed 1st stage. I'll show you the excavation that shows the later stage, but there was an earlier stage below it. Of the 1st century, they also are seeing a bench around the prayer hall. And then what you have up in the middle, you can barely see it, but it is a Torah niche. And then to the side is typical also for diaspora synagogues that they not only had a prayer hall, but also a room this was for a guest house and for eating and so forth. So it's as diaspora synagogues today also function, you often have a complex where you can have a bar mitzvah and a wedding, a bat mitzvah and other things. And in Israel, you tend not to have that because there are plenty of other places to do those things. So this is the 4th century Italy remains of that synagogue with the same ground, but we don't have the evidence. It's not visible, the evidence of benches, but they could well also have been. Okay, then if we go far to the east, at Dura Europas in Syria, which functioned until 256 CE, we have this doesn't do justice to the colors. The colors are amazing, beautiful paintings, and what we have around the bottom is, again, benches. Some scholars looking for a women's section said, well, you have this small room adjoining it, maybe the women sat there. There's too much foot traffic between the prayer hall and this other room, so if you have a separate section, it's separate. You don't go running in between the two. Now, later synagogues, by which I'm talking about antiquity, so the 4th to the 7th century, archaeologists sometimes reconstruct. So you will see images of a women's gallery above. But in analyzing the evidence, I have found that it's often with little evidence. So they might find 2 smaller columns. They have large columns for the lower level, then they might find 2 or even 1 smaller column. They say, aha, that was for the women's gallery. So it's often with little evidence, and what we don't have is, we don't have inscriptions that say, so-and-so donated a women's gallery or a women's section. We do have that say, so-and-so donated this chancel screen, or so-and-so donated 10 feet of the mosaic. So we have other donative inscriptions that tell what they donated. We don't have anything for a women's section or women's gallery. We don't have literary evidence that say, in ancient synagogues, there should be a women's section or women's gallery. We have allusions The rabbis, in the course of time, are concerned about separation. They're principally concerned about separation where alcohol is involved. So they say at a wedding, you should put down pottery shards down the middle. Okay? In other words, that's something very transitory. Just put down pottery shards. And there's alcohol. Or in the temple, there was one day on which there was alcohol, and they tried to figure out. They put the women below, and then they said, no, that didn't work. Then they put the women above, and that didn't work. There was much revelry. So they're concerned about alcohol and how it affects people. In the earliest churches, also, we don't have a separation. And 4th century church father John Chrysostom in Syria rails against his congregation, that he says they're like after each other. The women and the men are after each other here, and it wasn't like that in the early church. And according to the Acts of the Apostles, they were together in one room, and they were pure and holy, and now look at you. And so it shows that there wasn't. It was like maybe they felt they had to bring it in the course of time. Okay, so from all of this, I would argue that a tumtum and an androgynous likely sat with everybody else. That women, men, and non-binary persons prayed together and listened to the Torah together. That's one of the principal purposes of the synagogue, is to listen to the public Torah reading. Okay, now I'm going to turn to the question of who led ancient synagogues. So first, one of the titles used that is attested in ancient inscriptions, but also in the New Testament and other Christian sources, which can be very helpful sources, even though they sometimes are polemical for Jewish history, simply because of what they talk about. They are many scholars now, Jewish New Testament scholars who have contributed enormously to the field, and Christian New Testament scholars who have studied more Judaism, see that the New Testament can be a source for Jewish history. You have to be careful, but you have to be careful with any source. Anybody who studies history knows you're careful with any source. So, one of the main titles was archisynagogoi, heads of synagogues, and it's not used in the singular. We'd have talk of multiple heads of synagogues. So, my beautiful font disappeared. It's fine, but I had a beautiful font. I used a Herculaneum font to make it look kind of ancient. So you'll just have to imagine it. Okay, so this inscription reads, Rufina, a Jewish woman, head of the synagogue, in Greek, archisynagogos, built this tomb for, now it doesn't say her in the Greek. It could be for her, freed people, so formerly enslaved people, and for, I'm using the term slave because I think that's the better way of interpreting this inscription. Otherwise, I use enslaved persons to stress that a human being is a human being in a state of enslavement. But here, slave may be more the way that people were thinking about it. So it's always a question how to translate. Raised in household, and it doesn't say her household or the household. No one else has the right to bury anyone here. If someone should dare to do so, they will pay to the sacred treasury that is of the city 1,500 dinars and 1,000 dinars to the Jewish people. Okay, so it's a kind of curse. Okay, cursed be anyone who tries to bury anyone here. And this kind of inscription is typical in this region, in this time. People were very concerned about people coming in, grave robbing, burying other people, disturbing the tomb. So it's rather typical. A wonderful scholar of ancient Judaism and early Christianity and other Greco-Roman religions, Ross Kramer, has argued that maybe these freed people and enslaved people actually belonged to the synagogue, and she was donating a tomb for those who belonged to the synagogue. So I don't know, but it is the case that ancient institutions also were enslavers. So early Christian churches held people enslaved to take care of the church. And ancient synagogues could well have done the same thing. You have other organizations that do that. So it could be that they didn't belong to her. In any case, she would have been an enslaver herself. Because, as you mentioned earlier, Professor Ahuvia, in the ancient world, in the ancient Mediterranean world, to have any level of wealth, and buying a tomb is a level of wealth, you benefited from the work of enslaved laborers, mostly whom you yourself owned, felt that you owned, believed that you owned. And so Jews are like anybody else in the Roman world. They too benefited from slavery. Christians did, Jews did, other people did, they did. Now, no one else has the right to bury anyone here, and they should pay. And I missed one line here. Yes, they also, a copy of this inscription, I may have sent the wrong slide. A copy of this inscription has been deposited in the archive. Aha. Okay, so don't even think about it. You can take away this inscription, but there's a copy in the archive. And this is typical also. So this was from Smyrna in Western Asia Minor, which is today Turkey. So that is the Greek. We have some people here who read Greek, so I'm leaving it up here just for you to look at. You can see that this community, people in the community spoke Greek. That's very typical for diasporan Jews throughout the ancient Mediterranean, that they spoke Greek. This is after the conquest of Alexander the Great, in which Greek became the lingua franca of the Western Mediterranean. Okay, so now let me tell you a story. So first of all, this is a mummy portrait. It is not a portrait of Rufina, but Rufina could have looked something like this. And it's from Egypt, so it's kind of right next door, except that she's in Asia Minor, but we don't know where she came from exactly. Originally, she may have been born in Asia Minor. So this is a wealthy woman. How do we know that? Well, 3 ways right off the bat. First of all, her hair is very carefully braided. So in Latin, one used the term ornatrix, which was an enslaved woman. Oh, I've got people shaking their heads. Yes, I love that. Ornatrix, you studied ornatrix somewhere in somebody's class. An ornatrix was an enslaved woman dedicated to taking care of the mistress with respect to her hair and clothing and so forth, but especially hair. And they had very complicated braids that would require high levels of sophistication and skill. Secondly, she's wearing earrings with 3 pearls on each side. Pearls were very expensive, and they were particularly valuable because in the ancient world, before the rise of faceting of stones, pearls were ready to go as jewelry right out of the ocean or the Persian Gulf, probably. And having 3 is like a big deal. Then she's wearing this beautiful gold necklace. And again, gold is also something that's jewelry, you just take it and have it as jewelry. And it's beautifully done. I was trying to think what fancy jeweler would I compare it with today? I don't know. It's not exactly Tiffany's. It's not exactly Cartier, but it's somewhere up there. Okay, so let me tell you a story. So imagine this scenario. On the first day of the week in 256 CE in Western Asia Minor, Rufina, Trufosa, and Pharnaces hurry along the narrow street toward the largest synagogue in Smyrna. As is proper, Trufosa accompanies her mistress whenever the latter goes out in public. Rufina has prepared well for the synagogue council meeting. As one of the heads of synagogue, she will deliberate with other council members which builder to hire. Pharnaces, the steward of Rufina's family olive farm, has brought a project drawing that his mistress Rufina commissioned. Drawn in ink on papyrus, the plan for an opulent new synagogue complex excites her. Rufina hopes that with this plan, she can persuade the other heads of synagogue and the elders to contract with her builder. She plans, together with her family, to donate generously to the synagogue, which might help convince the council to hire her outstanding but expensive builder. Upon arrival, Rufina and Pharnaces go to the front, while Trufosa retreats to the back and the side of the room. After people greet one another and ask about one another's families, the meeting starts. Another head of the synagogue, Jacob, Jacob in Greek, makes his case for a less expensive builder. An elder named Dosas and a few others side with Jacob. But the attractive plan that Pharnaces has brought with him in Rufina's announcement of a donation that could cover the extra costs carry the day, the council votes to meet with Rufina's proposed builder. So this is a fictitious scenario that I've created, but based on historical evidence. And for me, leadership means decision-making capacity. So one of the things that we know about archisynagogoi is they were often responsible for the building, upkeep, expansions, remodelings of synagogues. We find that in inscriptions. And so I imagine here her working with others to carry the day. Also, in my earlier work on this, I tended to think more atomistically of individual women exercising decision-making power, whereas on the basis of other research, I've come to see it more as families, as women speaking on behalf of families, working with families, so it's not separate from a family. And this is one of the functions. It's not the only function, but I think this can help us to imagine one of the functions. So there are other female heads of synagogue, such as Theopempte, head of the synagogue, Archisynagogos or Archisynagogissa, and of her son Eusebius. Also Turkey, Asia Minor, Sophia of Gortun, elder and head of the synagogue. So she has two titles, Archisynagogissa, the female form, like you can either have the kind of male form but can count for women and men, or a feminized form, Archisynagogissa. Of Kissamos lies here, the memory of the righteous one forever, or one also found in Asia Minor, more to the east, to the east, of the Jewish woman, head of the synagogue, Archisynagogissa, in peace her sleep. And then we have a Hebrew inscription incised into a gravestone, reused in a house in Byblos, Syria, what is today Lebanon, mid to late 4th century. So in Hebrew, may the pity of Adonai, my God, be on Sambathion Archonit in Hebrew, the year 416, March 30th. And we have in Thessaly in Asia Minor, tomb of Peristeria, leader, Archegissa, so it's not the same exactly. Archisynagogos, it's another word for being a leader. We have other female titles, including elders, mothers of the synagogue, presiding officer of a Jewish charity, and priestess. And I can talk about priestess, that's a more complicated matter. Here we have one example of an elder, tomb of Rebecca Presbytera, who has fallen asleep. And here you can see the seven-branched menorah and an etrog at the base. That's common also. So etrogim or a lulav are common symbols used. So what are the attested duties of heads of synagogue? First, building and repairing the synagogue, I mentioned, also arranging for the liturgy. So, for example, in the New Testament, we find Paul speaking in synagogues, or a well-educated, highly educated Alexandrian Jewish man named Apollos, who comes to a synagogue, and so a guest comes to a synagogue, and the heads of the synagogue, or others also, but especially the heads of the synagogue, say, would you like to say a word for the people gathered here? And so, they stand up and give a kind of teaching on the Torah. Then you also have, they might be, and that's the big question, would they be reading from the Torah and the prophets? That could be another thing. And although you wouldn't think that a woman could read from the prophets, there is a passage in the Tosefta, that same early rabbinic work to which I referred, Tosefta Megillah, on the Megillah, the Purim, the Esther, that it says everybody, even including a woman, may read from the Torah. But then it goes on to say, but we don't do that. Okay. But why do they say anyone may? So in other words, it looks as if that is a tradition that they have to mention and then say why they don't. But so there's something embedded there that could indicate that they could. They didn't want to embarrass men who couldn't read. Okay, so we don't want to embarrass the men. They could also instruct the community. Again, we find that in the New Testament. They could make Jewish legal and other decisions within the synagogue. So you would have a range of legal decisions. You sometimes have a mikveh connected with it, so you're going to have decisions about how to make the mikveh and so forth. Okay, so what could women do? Could women do these things? Well, most people in the Roman world were illiterate. And illiterate women could handle their affairs. It's not that you couldn't get by being illiterate. So, for example, in the Judean desert, we found archives of a woman named Bavta, who has legal matters. She has a dispute with her in-laws, and she's able to carry on pretty well on her own. So she has scribes. She goes to people, she gets help. So you could do a lot being illiterate. But we also have evidence of highly educated Jewish women. So there's an author named Mosso, a philosopher named Skepsis, a physician named Salome, an alchemist named Maria. And we have evidence of women, ordinary women, being literate, about whom Professor Ahuvia has written. So these, to summarize then, are attested duties of the synagogues, and I see that women could have been involved in these. I don't think we're talking about large numbers of women. We're not talking about egalitarianism. I think that women probably were marginalized, but the question is, could any women do this? And I think some could and did. Maybe the titles were honorific, just given to them because they donated money. Oh, that's so lovely, you've given all this money, Rufina. We will make you an archisynagogos, but doesn't mean you can do anything. So, as I said, they often donated with their families, but what we find is there are many donative inscriptions. There is the one that I showed you of Theopempte, who donates a chancel screen, a portion of a chancel screen, but they mostly, the donative inscriptions mostly do not, hardly ever have a title associated with the person who gives it. So it seems to be insufficient. People had previously said, well, maybe there were the wives of, like the Rebbetzin of the Archisynagogues, the wife of the Archisynagogue. We don't have husbands mentioned in almost all of these, and when we do, there is one example of a woman who has one title and her husband has a different title. So that doesn't hold water. Well, some scholars, such as Tessa Rajak and David Noy, who both are really extraordinary scholars, argue that all of the titles in the synagogue were honorific. That they all were, and it's directed against my work among others, that they all were honorific. None of these had any power associated with them. And then the question that's for them is, okay, who did the leading of the synagogue? Who did the work? Who did the organizing? Who arranged for the liturgy? And they proposed that the actual leaders were prophets or charismatics. Well, maybe, but that's not written anywhere. So I'm cautious on that score. So what can we learn? Synagogues varied. Synagogues today vary. They varied in the ancient Mediterranean. There's shaky evidence for gender segregation. Non-binary Jews, perhaps there was no problem about where to sit. They were not egalitarian, but varied. Some Jewish women gave much, were deeply committed to shaping Jewish life. They wanted their synagogues and their communities to thrive. They gave of their time, of their energy, of their money, and some in turn, recognized their leadership and allowed them to make decisions. So, thank you very much. Perfect. Great. Thank you very much.
Please come take a seat.
Yes, thank you.
So thank you so much for that
Can we stand?
presentation. Yeah,
Maybe
stand.
I'll stand when I answer. Yeah, I
Great.
just like to stand.
Wonderful. So thank you again so much. So I want to start with the first question that was placed here, and I'm actually very curious about it too. You've heard about the Brooten phenomenon, which was coined by Sarah Parks. There's been 2 articles where she discusses the Brooten phenomenon. What do you make of that, and where do you think we go from here with this issue that the scholarship of so many feminist scholars of religion isn't cited and integrated into the field?
Well, I have one idea, which is create stones of granite and deeply incise into them what we do. Okay? If we depend on digital transmission, paper transmission, we may not be there. I found these women from inscriptions. I take a lesson from that. So I am, with respect to history, both the eternal optimist and the eternal pessimist. Or I heard a wonderful phrase just recently, the anxious optimist. So I think we have to keep speaking, we keep questioning, we find ways for our work to be transmitted and taught, and we keep challenging. So one thing that I'm disturbed about is 2 relatively recent, or actually 3 books on ancient synagogues have hardly anything on women or gender. After the work that we've done, they have hardly anything. A few people agree with me and cite Brooten, this and that, but they don't go further. They don't ask questions. They don't, encourage their students to write about it and find new material or whatever. I mean, I'm always open to critique when the critique is based on evidence. And I love to, change views. That's great. That's what scholarship is. But I think that we now are at a very difficult point for funding, for example. So one of the very first things that the NIH did, the National Endowment, and NEH, the National Endowment for the Humanities, was we are not accepting applications that have gender or women in them. Okay, so cut it out. Don't create that knowledge. Well, I've received 2 National Endowment for the Humanities grants, one for my book, Love Between Women, that would never go today, and one for enslaved women and female enslavers in early Christianity, that would not go today. So we need to find ways to support research to get these policies reversed and to keep creating for the new generations to ask questions. One of the greatest honors was what you mentioned, the Bernadette Brooten Award of the Society of Biblical Literature, and I am able to go to it each year and listen. And when I was awarded this honor, I said, oh, I just look forward to it. You'll be there and you'll be criticizing Brooten this and Brooten that, and wonderful. That's what we want, engagement and new thinking. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so another very popular question here is, how has the gender nature of languages like Hebrew and Greek in the sources shaped how we understand and imagine genderqueer folks in the ancient world?
Okay, that is a great question. Now, with respect to Hebrew, as a Semitic language, like Arabic and other Aramaic, other Semitic languages, gender imbues the whole language. So it's not just a noun or even an adjective. In German and French and Italian, the gender is not only in the noun, but also in the adjective accompanying it. Whereas in English, we don't have either of those. That is common nouns, like a table is masculine in one language and neuter in another, and so forth. But then with respect to human beings, you also have the adjective being one or another. In Hebrew and in Arabic and Aramaic, you have gender in the verb. Yeah. So the verb is different. If I say I speak, if I say you masculine speak or you feminine speak, it's a different form. So that makes it much more complicated. And Greek doesn't have exactly the same problem. Greek has 3 grammatical genders. And what I've been fascinated about, actually, with Latin also has 3 genders, and I've been fascinated to learn of classicists who are working on figuring out how to refer to a non-binary person in Latin. I think that's in the Women's and Gender LGBTQ Classical Caucus. I think you've been involved in that. I mean, you have, yeah. So people are trying to figure it out. I know people in Yiddish tried to figure out how to refer to gay people, freilich, they say, which is gay, happy, and transgender people. So people are trying to figure it out, but these ancient terms, I mean, I think that the wonderful essay, Lusty Ladies, in which you do an emic, that is, you say, okay, people are trying to figure out active, passive, what exactly does it mean? And you say, well, let's look at the ancient categories. Let's look at the ancient terminology. And so that's also what I'm trying to do. And see, androgynous just can mean all kinds of things. And so I want to bring that all in. Yeah, thank you.
I love how you mentioned that just as we encounter confusion with terminology today, the ancients probably did as well. I think that's really helpful. Because often, we think that there was some golden age where everything was clear, right? It's the golden age of monogamy and marriage. No, that did not quite exist.
Can I say one more thing on that point here, which I didn't? I just want to mention every time I talk about the androgynous or a person whom we would call intersex, I have some hesitation about applying that to antiquity. Others don't, but and that is the phenomenon would have been more broadly known than today in the U.S. because of the U.S. and Western medical focus on disambiguating at birth. So surgeries performed at birth, the physician would come to the parents and say, well, you know, we have a little abnormality here. We can take care of it very quickly. We should do it soon. And, you know, then you won't have a problem. Well, and intersex people today are saying, I mean, the North American Intersex Society says, no. Let the child grow up and they can decide. But in antiquity, because you didn't have that level of medical intervention, it would have been more common. People in bathhouses would have seen a variety of bodies and in other settings. So I think they knew more than we do.
Yeah. And if I may, I'm going to cite something that you brought up, right? Which one of the most important things that Professor Brooten has done is simply catalog and bring to light evidence that has been ignored. So, right, the Pater Essa from Venosa has meant a lot to me. So in Venosa, there's an inscription of a leader of some sort who created their own title, right? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Does he say
The Pater Essa?
Oh, the Pater Essa. Yes, exactly. Yes, that's wonderful. So you have in Latin and in Greek a pater. So they're fathers of the synagogue. Patres ton synagogon. And the Roman lawgiver knows of that title. The Roman lawgiver, who was concerned about taxes and who had to pay them, and aren't we all, exempted, that's another current issue, exempted certain religious leaders from certain taxes, including physical labor on roads and this kind of thing. And so they exempted some Christian clergy and they exempted some Jewish, whom they thought of as clergy, and they included heads of synagogues and fathers of synagogues were among those. And so, whereas one might think, well, the title pater, that's just honorific, doesn't mean anything. But I argue, based on that, the Roman lawgiver isn't just going to give a tax exemption to anybody. They're going to give a tax exemption to somebody whom the Jewish community considers to be an official. And so you normally have mater in Greek, mater in Latin, mother of the synagogue, as a parallel. But one woman is called a pateressa, so a female father. And so it's fascinating. I think also of the title of the Mayor of London, which is the Lord Mayor of London. So the first woman to hold that title was called the Lady Lord Mayor of London. It's kind of comparable.
Yeah, so you see the parallel there.
Yeah.
Okay, so several people want to know more about the priestess reference. That we see.
Yes. Okay. So we have examples of Greek inscriptions in which a woman is called a hiereia or a hierissa. So the masculine form is hiereos. So what does this mean? And they are both in Israel and in Egypt. So, well, why would Jews write that title? Well, other people coming by and seeing it would think of priestesses in temples in other religious traditions. Well, in Hebrew, you have the title Kohen, as priest, and you have the title Kohenet. Now, a Kohen becomes a priest in one way by being born one. You don't become one, you are born one or not born one. Kohenet becomes a Kohenet, a female Kohen, in two ways. By being the daughter of a Kohen, and that gives her the right, among other things, to eat of the priestly offering. So people give the priests food, a tithe, they give them their onions and grapes and whatever else they produce, pomegranates, I hope, some good figs in there, maybe some dates. And so they get to eat of it. And you can become a Kohenet by marrying a Kohen. So a Kohenet can be one of those things. And that says nothing about any functions. It's what your rights and duties are. So it could mean that. It may not have anything to do with, and so when I talk about that title, I just give 3 options. It could be that. Or it could be that they're known as that, as a hierea hieresa, but they don't necessarily have a synagogue function. Or they might, like, is it possible to imagine they could do something like the priestly blessing? On the one hand, it seems impossible. I don't know, it's worth a question, which is something that happens in a synagogue. Or, and this is most likely, or probably the only place it's likely, is in Egypt, where the title was found of a woman who lived in a city where there was a Jewish temple at the time at which she lived there. So there was more than one Jewish temple. The Jewish temple in Jerusalem is what we mostly think of, but that wasn't the only Jewish temple. There was the Onias temple, in Hebrew Honi, who was the high priest in Jerusalem and then was driven out, but considered himself to be the proper high priest, and he went to Egypt and found harbor there and started his own temple there, which then continued. So could she have had a function? Maybe there are other understandings of what women could do. So that's the one where I really say we don't know. There are 3 different functions. One might have to do with the synagogue, maybe not. One might have to do with the temple, maybe not. Or one might just be being born or marrying.
Thank you so much. So one topic I want to ask you about is storytelling. And so those of you here at UW might know that the 2 lovely scholars in the front row, Deborah Kem and Sarah Levin Richardson, and I are all really interested in critical fabulation. And I was just at a conference, and the person meeting me said, "Oh, it's just you and 3 other people who do critical fabulation." And I was like, "Wait, who are the other pre-modernists?" And they mentioned you 2, but then they also said, Bernadette Brooten has really been doing that for years. She just didn't call it critical fabulation. And so I wanted to ask you how you came to storytelling. And I have to admit, it's been so difficult for me to engage in that, because I still feel like I have to justify storytelling as historical practice. So how did you come to this, and how would you advise others to engage with storytelling?
Well, there are 2 ways of thinking about it. One is that you do the historical research, are extremely limited in what you say. So you just say what you can literally document. And then you write a historical novel, okay, which is a different thing. So, for example, Tia Miles, who has written a book that I highly recommend, I think it's called All That She Could Bring With Her, All That She Brought With Her, and it's a story of a embroidery on a sack that an enslaved mother gave to her daughter when they were going to be separated forever. And she writes on the outside of the sack what was in the sack. And the last was something like, I'm quoting this from memory, and a whole lot of love. But she puts things in the sack. And so Tia Miles, a historian, goes through each of the items and does the best and fullest history that she can do to show what those items would have been, how they would have been produced, how an enslaved person would have come by them, and so forth. But then I heard her on NPR, which I hope will still exist, in which she spoke about how, now I'd like to write a novel. In other words, that's one way to do it. You do this, and then you do that. You can do that. The other way is to do what some of us are trying to do, and that is create a story. And in my view, I should be able to footnote every line of it. Okay? So in other words, I am not making it up out of whole cloth. So when I have Trufosa, which is a typical name for enslaved women, when I named her Trufosa, you're shaking your heads, you know these things. Okay? Delight, like these are the kinds of names given to enslaved women, which indicates the sexual use of enslaved women and so forth. There are others also named Trufosa, but that's one thing. Goes off to the side. She's supposed to be there. She ensures the honor of her mistress by accompanying her in public, but she's supposed to fade away into the corner. And the steward could be literate, very good in math, a good accountant, could enter, according to Roman law, could enter into legal agreements on behalf of the owner and is in a different position. So, I try to be very careful, and I think we should critique one another on those things, if we do something that isn't historically possible. But I kind of have done them because I can't not. I just want to envision what I'm studying. Maybe I'm wrong, or maybe historians shouldn't do it. I don't know, but to me, it's how can I imagine? I have to imagine an archisynagogos, a female archisynagogos, and that's the way I did it. Yeah.
Well, thank you for inspiring all of us to do the same practice. So one of the questions here is about female heads of synagogues. Like, how do you imagine that they became educated and even literate? Their families must have valued their education as much as that of male children. So how do you imagine them preparing for those roles?
Well, first of all, I would say they didn't have to be literate. In other words, you could carry out those duties. You couldn't read from the Torah, but you could carry out other duties without being literate. I think of it as, if I have a legal matter, I don't have to go and study law. I hire a lawyer. Okay? I need somebody. If I use a tax accountant to file my taxes because they know more. They say you can put it in this category or this category, where should we do it? And so people in antiquity could hire scribes. You could dictate. You might have an enslaved person. You've written about this. You may have an enslaved person, even including a woman, not even a woman, but including a woman who could write for you. And so some of it you didn't have to have a high level of education for, but I do imagine some families either especially focused on education, and we certainly have that in Jewish families in antiquity, a strong focus on education. That is the whole point of the Pharisees, that is the whole point of Chazal, is teaching children, mostly sons, but I assume that a father could teach a daughter, they might have a tutor, a mother might teach a daughter. So I think there are different ways in which it happens, and it has happened in other periods of Jewish history that a father who wants his daughter to learn Torah will do it, will teach her. So I think that kind of thing is also possible.
So one of our audience members noticed that many of your examples were from Asia Minor. Mm-hmm. Is there a particular reason for that, or are there areas where do you think there are more female leaders than others, or is it just like happenstance and survival of the evidence?
Thank you very much. So no, I don't think it's happenstance, and it is especially striking the female archisynagogoi being from Asia Minor. Now, we have elders also, and elders occur in other places. So there are quite a number of elders in Italy, for example, or mothers of the synagogue in Italy. And we have a very interesting example where in the same time period, we have a bishop, Bishop Gelasius, who, referring to women of southern Italy, doing what they should, Christian women now, doing what they shouldn't do, including being elders. And at the same time, we have Jewish female elders in the same region at the same time. So that's really striking to me, whether one is borrowing from the other or they're simply influencing or they're independent of each other, but they're all living together. And so we do have some clusterings of categories. We have a gerusiarches is a term. It's not used for women, so it is again that same root arch from rule, lead, or beginning, and a gerusiarches is theoretically an older man who leads. So you might have a council with a gerusiarches at the head of it, but we don't have that everywhere. We have it in some places. So yes, there would be a clustering, and the thing that's important to know with respect to Judaism, and most people in the room may know it, but not everybody, and that is you don't have uniformity. There is no pope. Okay, there's no Jewish pope, and even the patriarch in Jerusalem is not telling everybody what to do. People decide on their own. You have diversity. The congregations decide, the regions decide, and so it is a different model. Now in Christianity, you do have the Bishop of Rome, and you have bishops. You have a clear hierarchy, which you don't have in Judaism, that's above a number of congregations. It doesn't mean that people followed it, but you theoretically were supposed to. But we find examples in Christianity of women being named bishops and elders, and that knowledge has come down to us from the church fathers who opposed them. So you may recall that President Trump referred to the Episcopal priest, bishop, as, let's see, what was the phrase? The somewhat of a bishop. What did he say exactly? I'm trying to remember. The so-called bishop, I think is what he called her, the so-called bishop. Oh, that reminded me of Epiphanius. I've been there before. I've heard that. When Epiphanius, a church father, also speaks of these bishops and elders as, they're not really, and so forth. So you have a history of this. Yes.
Okay. We only have a few minutes. We have so many good questions. Okay. So yes. Maybe we'll try to run through them quickly so everybody feels heard.
Yes.
So one person asked, were there women and non-binary persons involved in other religious capacities? I imagine that this is a field of research is yet unwritten, right? We're still working on that, right? Would you?
Well, I would say one thing, and that is some of the early Christian women, some of the women mentioned in the New Testament who understand themselves to be Jews. I know that is hard for people today to imagine and understand. Jesus wasn't the only Messiah in this period. There were other Messiahs who also had followers, and it didn't make you not a Jew to believe in a Messiah that some others didn't think was a Messiah. They maybe thought you were on the wrong track, but they didn't think that made you not a Jew. So Christianity eventually splits, but certainly not immediately. And some of the women who believed in Jesus as the Messiah would have been fully involved in their synagogues. One of them was Priscilla, who in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 18, with her husband takes an Alexandrian rhetorically trained scholar aside after the synagogue service and teaches him more carefully the way of the Lord. Then you have Junia, named an apostle in Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 16, verse 7, who is Jewish and who is named an apostle. So I think that we also need to consider these other kinds of leadership. That's not synagogue leadership, but it's leadership within a movement. I think we could put Mary Magdalene in that category because she follows Jesus. She fulfilled some of the functions of what or she fulfills the functions of what Paul called an apostle. She's later called an apostle outside of the New Testament. And, she surely went to the synagogue, and she supported Jesus out of her own means and followed him. So I think that Jewish women, and certainly also non-binary people, I just am looking for the sources, were involved at other levels of organization and leadership and so forth. And these messianic movements, John the Baptizer surely also had female followers, would have been part of that.
Okay, so maybe we should end with kind of what happens next. What happens in the Middle Ages, and why do you think that synagogues began to have gender segregation, and why were women losing leadership roles in the Middle Ages, if they were?
Well, the first thing I always say is I'm cautious to say when it ended, because somebody may find sources to show something else. Maybe it evolved. Maybe it was something different. So, for example, within Christianity, what we've learned about abbesses, who had great power and authority in the West, and we learned about St. Nino, who was the person who brought Christianity to the Armenians. We have learned over the years with more women's and gender research that more has been happening in the course of history that has been overlooked. Even Regina Jonas in Germany, the first woman ordained in modern times as a rabbi, was ordained in the 30s after she wrote her thesis on why women should be allowed to be ordained according to rabbinic thinking. And she found a rabbi who ordained her. I could go on about her, but she died, she was murdered in the Holocaust, and in the concentration camp to which she was sent, she ministered as a rabbi to her people. So she's of great encouragement to me. But we uncover these stories that had been hidden. So let's see, what was it say again, Nicole?
Why do women kind of seem to lose out?
Why
does gender segregation begin in the Middle Ages?
It certainly does. Well, what I would say is I think of it either more as like this or as cyclical. Mm-hmm. In other words, that phenomena do come again. So, for example, Martin Luther was out to reform the Christian church, and so he said, celibacy, let's get rid of that. Well, that had some advantages for women. It also meant that these high-ranking abbesses or other women who lived in communities didn't have that within Protestantism. So, look at it either way. Patriarchy is a complicated term. It can be overly simplified, and I don't want to use it in an essentializing way. It's always connected with other forms of power, whether it's ethnic or racial or enslaved and free and so forth. So it's never just about fatherly rights. But given all of those cautions, I would still say, as I heard a historian once say, patriarchy is ever self-correcting. It always figures out how to push women out or marginalize women, bring women under male control. And I do think that a lot of that did happen in the Middle Ages, and maybe, the rabbinic thinking about yichud was important, and then they learned from the Christians, the Jews, and the Muslims learned from one another, and so there's that too. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe we'll just end with the note of, that feminists teach us that we have to study these contested contexts, that these things always emerge in argument and strife, and there's a lot of work for us to do, The past is yet unwritten, so I want to ask you all to join me in thanking Professor Brooten for a wonderful presentation and discussion. Thank you.